Roemer is one of the, well, to use my language, one of the emergent phenomena of the Netherlands. In fact, one of the emergent critics and theoreticians and architectural writers. And I've had the pleasure of working quite closely with him for several years now in the Berlage Institute. He's head of history and theory of the Berlage Institute in Amsterdam, and one of the few people who's able to take on critically the miracle of the young Dutch officers. Anyway, welcome.
Yeah, of course, I'd like to thank the AA and especially Raoul and Petra for inviting me. And the more we work together also at the Berlage Institute, we find out that we are more or less have the same interests. What I will do in this lecture is actually a kind of, although I will read it mostly, is a kind of work I'm busy with in trying several aspects, and that's first of all trying to understand how our modernity or how our modernization is actually continuing, and how to understand that kind of what is called more and more second modernity, just to get a grip on what's going on. The other aspect is that I especially like to look to a kind of new generations of architecture, or not especially generation, because I'm not so interested in looking to generations, but what kind of new approaches in architecture and urbanism are in fact working in that second modernity. So how are they trying to operate in new modernizations? We also saw some efforts already and experiments in the studio presentations the last 2 days. Then the third thing is that I don't only want to look actually what is going on and how the second modernity is implemented in recent works or trying to deal with it, but I also like to see what kind of attitudes or what kind of ideologies are being expressed in these works which relate with the second modernity. And there I speak about, especially about much Netherlands work, but I think you see it all over the world, also in art and architecture. There's a tendency which I call fresh conservatism, which is fresh, but in fact it's a kind of new, dynamic, conservative aspects which you find in a new attitude. And with that kind of fresh conservatism, it's more a frame of thinking, it's not a movement. I in fact want to try to get rid of the problem of fresh conservatism, which occurs very quickly when we start to work in that new society. So this lecture will deal about those 4 points. So how to understand our second modernity. So we will look to a few spatial implications, and we do it in a quite kind of overview. Then I will indicate what the new generation or new kind of architecture practices have in common, how do they work, and then I will explain shortly fresh conservatism, and then I try to hint also through one concrete example what the alternative could be, how that is structured. And this talk will be a little bit abstract, partly because I'm still working on gathering all kinds of examples and strategic devices which are not yet worked out. So I hope that also the images I show you will somehow hint you to thinking in devices and in practical approaches. And also what I try to do with the images, that they are not always parallel with what I tell. So sometimes there is a kind of provocation, or sometimes I indicate to maybe that there are fresh conservatives or not. So I hope I can, through the images and the text I speak, you're somehow also provoked. Well, this image, to already say something about the society of the end, is that in this image in Italy, there's Umbria, is on a mountain. I think for the Italian people under us, you all still will recognize the Italian culture, but that we leave aside. What you see, in fact, here is a kind of first modernity, and you also see our second modernity. For instance, so you see them at the same time in one image. And the first modernity is actually, in the first modernity, is still linear organized. You still can think in classes. There's still a real There are state organizations, there are real institutions like religion which still represent the society, and also the reading in a kind of dialects between classes, male, female, still operate in the society. What you see, it's a kind of modernization because the cross is not a heavy stone like in the zero modernity, you could say, but it is already somehow transparent, it's a rational construction, etc., etc. Of course, the second modernity is a kind of expression of the global society, of the network society, where things are interlinked through all kinds of networks, where there is a much bigger complexity. It's not so much an architecture or a structure anymore, which represents in a kind of icon what the society is about. Still, you can say it is a new kind of religion, but totally different expressed, and you can also see that all kind of individual parties have stake in that thing. So it's a very much individualization which is expressed collectively. You can also see that it's standing on a container. The container is halfly falling apart, although at the same time it functions very well. I won't say too much about the image, but you can read many, many aspects of it. Also interesting, what I said is that actually the first modernity and the second modernity still are together. It's not that we are now in a kind of second modernity and that the first modernity is over. They overlap. But I will come back to that. Good. They meet each other in France. He belongs to the new manager's elite. He helps to make the polder model of the Netherlands come true. Yesterday, she was still throwing snowballs in the sauna with her grandmother. Some hours before this cool event, she enjoyed an ostrich steak at the Copacabana with her grandfather. He, the constructivist, dreams of a traditional family house close to the desert of Las Vegas. She is a chip designer and loves the opera. With surprise and amusement, they chatted about the news in the New York Times that researchers found female ice bears with little penises because of PCB pollution in Spitsbergen, Alaska. Right now, as we can see, they enjoy the World Cup football match, the Netherlands against Brazil, somewhere in Marseille, France. He in a traditional woman costume from the Dutch village Rotterdam, and she is dressed in the football shirt of the player Romário of Brazil. Never before the samba was so liberating and at the same time so conventional as ever before. Contrary, this is in Italy, contrary to what some people claim, this situation doesn't mean the end of human history, but the opposite. History is just beginning. After a long prehistoric struggle with nature, first for survival and then to conquer it, we have achieved a level of knowledge and social organization that, provided we reside in the better half of this paradise, enables us to live in a social world. What this social world will look like and whether we will find it out our liking, time alone can tell. The fact is that the late capitalist system that emerged victorious after the fall of the Berlin Wall can no longer derive its raison d'existence from blaming the other. There are no enemies anymore, as we can see here in Berlin and the wall and what's happening on two sides. Polarities of good and evil no longer serve to justify the civilization process we are involved in. Either-or categories such as east, west, or left and right have lost their substance. Since the Cold War, the West has been engaged in a crisis of how to cope with its own success. The agenda for social possibilities has to be drawn up all over again. What modernity is or might become is less clear than ever. The political and social lexicon of space, city and architecture, and of the distinctions between public and private has become obsolete at a stroke and has to be rewritten. Formerly, the dominant forces were separation and specialization, the struggle for clarity and the reduction of the world to calculable proportions. Now we talk of simultaneity, multiplicity, uncertainty, chaos theory, networks, infrastructures, non-linearity, hubs and nodal points, interaction, the hybrid, ambivalence, schizophrenia, spatial flows, cyborgs, and so on. Here we see, by the way, an interior of in Hanoi, and it looks like if you're really in an interior, but in fact I'm standing in the street, and it's a very active street, and I make a photo into their living room, and this living room is at the same time a place where you can be invited to have a drink and pay for it, so it's a restaurant. At the other time it's also a computer place, and you can link up with internet, but their home has, so at the same time, many functions at the same time, has traditional functions and also very, call it second modernity functions. So the either-or world in which we think, act and live has increasingly become an illusion. Our modernity no longer develops mainly in instrumental, rational and linear terms. Instead it takes its direction from the rules of side effects, what we can also see here. So, and this is in Tokyo, an indoor skiing. In short, we live in a new modernity characterized by a chaos that tends to become ever more complex. In one way or another, conflicts and experiments are emerging that cut a path beyond all either polarities. So in short, we live in a society of the and, A and D. And here we see another example that it's very convenient in the city of Maastricht. It's a very classical, beautiful city. It's really better to have your Jaguars on top of each other. So in this end condition, old values, strategies and instruments no longer work. Property developers, architects, artists, banks, the media, scientists and multinationals are all devising new spaces and images in order to give a lead to this new reality. So a vacuum has been created in which an unprecedented degree of innovation, for us architects also, has a chance of success, because nobody knows what the appropriate response to the situation really is. Research, analysis and experiment bottom-up is being promoted by all the parties that have a stake in this new artificial landscape. This is Windows on the World in China, so the Chinese can experience our Europe all together in one theme park. The point is to reformulate in the midst of economical correctness, the collapse of national democracy, what the network society, where the megacity with its new middle-class identity is the dominant force, with an abundance of luxury, leisure, comfort and virtuality, could be a place of sociality, adventure, suspense, different differences, without becoming either a heterogeneous space where nothing matters anymore, or would become a kind of totalitarian state. This is in London. Today, middle-class identity more than any time before is colonizing the world. The potential of our middle-class culture for assimilation has surpassed all expectations. It is a process of leveling under the guise of fragmentation. All kinds of utopias and totalizing dreams are disqualified. The process of speedy modernism also leaves people behind. But it's no longer as in the days of heroic modernism about class awareness and possible avant-gardes writing manifestos for a better future. With simple distinctions between classes and the like, we can no longer do much. Because also the genius of trends is engaged in the most exceptional, random, even uncontrollable contradictions and new possibilities. And the non-class, as here we see in Tokyo, does no longer even have the possibility of an awareness or an address to revolutionize against. There is no enemy anymore to address your anger or your bad condition against. So this homeless people can simply vanish, although I think we don't longer need them in the system, which of course is a huge problem. So there exists a kind of controversy in whatever form the we, instead of only the I, or collective identity can be discovered or uncovered, what predominantly holds people together under conditions of advanced individualization, now that the opposing factor is no longer a consensus on religion, status, class, male and female identities, and the like. We can even say, and this is in Tokyo, we can even say with Manuel Castells and Jean Baudrillard that in the society of the end, the architecture in the landscape of megacity architecture is stripped bare. In fact, has become naked. In Tokyo, for instance, it does no longer matter how a building looks like. Any style and design is all right and does not dominantly influence the cultural meaning of the place. The object itself does no longer represent the culture of place. We clearly experience in Tokyo and other cities that architecture is enslaved to all functions of circulation, information, communication, and culture. There is a gigantic functionalism in all this, and it is no longer a functionalism based in a mechanical world of organic needs, a real social relation, but a functionalism of the virtual. And now I come to the second part. So far, more or less a rough sketch of how our society of the end looks like. Let's look at what kind of praxis we see in the young, mostly young practices working in the society of the end. And here, of course, we see a kind of condition where all kinds of values overlap, or not overlap, but come together. Instead of explaining what I said, the society of the end in its full complexity, I have said already this, I will do a kind of reality check and see what kind of practices operate in this reality. So popular culture seems to be making a comeback in the world of architecture. Commonplaces of our everyday experience are rediscovered and reinvented by young practices of architecture. We no longer feel a need to escape the real world. Instead, we are eager to step into the river of our second, more modern everyday lives. The idea of opting for another alternative world no longer seems interesting. Cultural products are no longer simply talking about themselves, but are engaged in a crossover with other systems and fields. Professions are being redefined. New instruments are being developed. Things are combined that we previously couldn't have dreamed of. And also the industry is doing it, so it is conservative and can be progressive. This is the universal zapper of Philips for the World Cup match. So you can zap to the football game and at the same time take a beer. In this supermodern condition, with its decentralized individualism, we can find and create gaps or voids that oppositional practices can exploit, practices that can no longer remain within the bounds of narrow specialist fields that have no meaningful connection with the everyday world. And this is an open air basketball field in Hong Kong, and in front of this basketball field is an important highway. It's a Kowloon. If you know Kowloon, it's a very dense area. We see that architecture is increasingly breaking free of representation as generated and maintained by the system. Priority is given instead to real presence. There is a need to break open a whole range of everyday conventions and stereotypes. Attitudes of distance or objectivity are shunned. Instead, people seek contact and interaction with the other in everyday reality. The position of architects is being dismantled. It is no surprise then that the phrase relational work is on everyone's lips. The new work is relational. Its content is the interhuman experiences that it generates. Every visitor becomes a spectator, discussion partner, or next door neighbor. So not what Norman Foster is doing. The recent Dutch architecture does not rely on any passive experience to restore contact with user and viewer. The keynote is now active participation. So this architecture and art aims to coincide with reality. And this is a view of the VPRO villa. It's not so much a will to abolish the profession, but more to liberate it from institutional representative structures, from the extolling of autonomy and the tradition of critical marginalism. It is a plea for acting and experiencing. It is inspired by a utopian desire to connect with time and reality, both being understood as fragmented. The traditional role of the architect are being reviewed once more. If it is to discover reality, the profession must reinvent itself. And here we see a work of art in Vienna where the artist put a heating system on the street and it's really working. So what you suddenly see is that all people gather around this heating system. The project didn't last because the artist had to pay the gas bill himself. So strategies and programs are devised that are the result of getting one's hands dirty, you could say, in everyday reality. So they speak the language of our mass production and circulation, of popular culture. It's an architecture against architecture. It does not attack the profession, rather it's a response to the mass presence of the other. The attempt is made to break free of space in the sense of demarcation, dependency, central management, centralized order and control. It aims to link up more places at once so as to escape from the suffocation of the enclosed. This is again a project by MVDV, and they were invited to make in front of the Richard Meier building in Barcelona a square, and they decided to make a football field in front of this museum. And I will show it again and probably tell something more if there is time for that. This new optimistic attitude distances itself from the deconstruction approach, from the belief in fragmentation and the impossibility of totality. And also the nostalgic image of the historical city has no fascination for it. As you can see in the slide, there's no fascination for the traditional city there. There is no longer any sympathy with the permanent criticism of society or with the paralyzing impossibility of making a better world, an attitude that degenerated into a strategy of negative criticism. Intellectual pessimism would appear to have turned into its opposite, an optimism of action. Life is no longer thought of as a linear process, but as a complex totality that is full of contradictions to work with. We are all guilty of, and we all profit from, the boons of schizophrenia and media addiction, the ecstasy of self-destruction and the seemingly total lack of borders. The important thing now is not to define what the identity of architecture today is, but what architecture can do, always depending on a specific territory and cultural program. I thought that we would see another slide, but this is in Singapore, and you can also see again that all kinds of styles are being combined. So there is not one truth anymore or one kind of architectural representation. This is the image I wanted to show. Here you see also that all kinds of, in that end condition and in many end works, also in advertising, besides that you see still a kind of colonialism or westernization in this culture and still a kind of role of the way the woman should be represented, so there are still many discriminating problems. You also see at the same time that all kinds of things are being combined. Combinations you would never have seen before, and which you can also not understand through the kind of classical readings of this. You can even see on the right that it's talking about event space. So it's very important ideologically to define politically what kind of events you create, because this is still, I think, a problematic image. So commitment is found today by today's young practices in the context of the actuality of the everyday. So these architects draw their inspiration of our society of the end, which we also saw in the image before. Fascinated, they wander through this second modernity, and we get our kicks from. This is a pile of postcards by NL architects, And you see, for instance, that they propose to transform the canals in swimming pools, but you can also see that instead of paying for parking, you get money for parking your car because Mazda is sponsoring the parking place at the Museumplein. So you try to work with the system instead of being against the system. So non-design, the non-places as places or places as non-places, slides the yes places, the outskirts, the terrain vague, the utterly normal, the musification of our inner cities, the theme parks, the voids and the everyday character of our mass culture is their chosen theme and inspiration. As specialized tourists, the young generation of Dutch architects record all the new phenomena that operate in our everyday space. And they do this with gusto and utmost jollity, with a roar of laughter and an enthusiasm that is often naive. They put off passing judgment. This is a project by John Cormeling, and he always has a carpet in his car, and he unrolls it, and he has a parking place where he wants to have it. With great efficiency and without once letting the word aesthetics pass their lips, they outline what amounts to a new aesthetic full of functional and pragmatic argumentation. A world is opened up where the presence of the past in the present has ceased to mean anything. Commitment is found in the context of the perfectly normal. They are not so much interested in the architectural objects as such, but far more in the activities that take place around, inside or through the object that is plonked down in a specific urban spot. Words such as emancipation, humanism or criticism are alien to their idiom. Theirs is a direct, practical approach. Research and analyze reality is their motto. Cooperate with the system, the market, the rules, and the norm. Don't reject them, make them work for you. We are all in the wave machine together. Discover the gaps and holes in our ever-changing condition. Be optimistic and be not sparing in one-word replies. More is possible, after all, than your prejudice can predict in advance. Go back. This new generation of architects always begins with research. They analyze that which is so normal that we almost fail to see it. The everyday world is their field of research and observation. If they operate correctly, they dismantle that which we would normally take for granted. This is important because it is precisely through normality that it is so unobtrusively we hardly notice it, that our second modernity life is changing so decisively. And here we see at the border in America, this is the Mexican border, and you have to be careful because there are families crossing the border. And actually we just pass by and we don't notice that, and I think it's very important to really look at this society and be concerned about all kinds of issues which are being acted out in the everyday. In the work of MVDV, for instance, systematic data are of crucial importance. They see the city as a datascape. They use a method based on systematic idealization, a spontaneous overestimation of whatever is available, a theoretical barrage in the course of which, due to a retroactive conceptual and ideological interventions, it is possible to integrate even mediocre elements. And I will show one. This is a better one than the one before. What they did here, for instance, is that very simple data is that you take, when you walk on the canals in Amsterdam and you look up, then you have, of course, a certain sight line. Well, if you take that sight line, so if you want to build in the inner court of those canal houses, if you would build a high block, you would, of course, constantly see the high block. So they took the sight line, the data of the sight line as a starting point, and if you cut the inner court according to the sight line, so you won't see it when you pass by the canal zone, in fact you can build a tremendous building in the inner court. It's of course an exaggeration of this technique of. The program of requirements, which sometimes seems impossible to comply with, is followed to the letter, as are the complex and stringent Dutch building regulations. By that they discover unclassified realities that chime perfectly within the real world on the one hand, while turning it upside down on the other. So what they did here, they had to build a narrow slab according to the standards in this area, and really there were some extra apartments the municipality wanted were hanging in the air. So what they did, they just glued them on the narrow slab, and they played the rules of the elderly housing norms. These young Dutch architecture practices strip bare a second modernity, or what I call a society of the end, that for many people is unconsciously experienced as a real virtuality, a simulation which has become very real. The dialectical thinking of our first modernity, born out of our difference between agricultural society and industrial modernization, between being at home and becoming homeless, or the unavoidable homeless condition, is no longer a way of understanding and being, to experience the world around us. As we can also see in the actually quite problematic image of black skin, white masks. There's no longer a feeling of any loss, although we live the copy by now. It no longer makes sense to try and preserve the traditional values of before the Industrial Revolution as a hearth of a resistance or a refuse for quality of life. The space of the second modernity has long since become commonplace. It no longer makes any sense seeing TV and image culture as the great Satan, as part of a technology that has let waste the authentic moments of the past. Our infrastructural landscapes are no longer any non-place. They are an activity of placing a public sphere in flux that becomes meaningful through different subjective moments. We no longer experience ourselves as homeless in our cars. The car can even be the ultimate place for letting yourself go in total privacy. And now I come to the third aspect, and that is fresh conservatism. The fact that these designers speak the language of our times, the one of our second or our society of the end, does not mean that they don't distance themselves from our mass culture at the same time. They express their opposition often through a degree of unease, radicalism, or better put, subversion, that at the very least provokes the public's curiosity. It asks questions and gives new answers. There's always a moment of estrangement that cannot be contained by the familiar. In this sense, they do not jive with mass culture. This is the VPRO building in the evening with black light under it. One can talk of a deliberate friction with our culture of consumption. In this sense, they are fresh. The danger, of course, is that the shock of the new does not go further than the shock itself. This is again the VPRO building. This is Lush Spijburg, this is the water pavilion. So the danger is that the shock of the new does not go further than the shock itself. All too soon, a shock will overtake its target. Of course, shock is the trick par excellence for attracting the attention of the media. The question remains, however, of where the shock is intended to take us, because if it doesn't take us beyond the spectacle, this freshness will only give us an unadorned dottiness promoting nothing but itself, as I think is happening with the work of Lush Spijburg. The question is whether this freshness is genuinely radical enough to change anything, or whether it just offers new images for what we have already without inventing or revealing the new in an innovative fashion. All what they can create in the end is perhaps a nostalgia for an imaginary, virtual, real present of the now, and I think we should do more than we see here. With the aid of the concept of horizontality, I can distinguish whether a work is fresh conservative or whether it goes a stage further. At present, the landscape plays a vital role in the organization of our urban condition. In architecture, we really have rediscovered the landscape. It looks as if it's no longer possible to devise any new decorative or compensatory role for the landscape. Instead, it is ascribed a complementary function and can be both an object and an instrument of intervention. Traditional categories such as soil, genius loci, and morphology give way to mobile interferences between situation, object, landscape, sociology, ecology, material, and politics. In this space, users and programs are in perpetual motion. An extremely diverse range of international and local infrastructures takes root here. The users of this landscape are no longer inhabitants in the traditional sense of the word. They are more like passers-by, nomads, and tourists. In many recent works of fresh conservatism and approaches which surpass fresh conservatism, as I think we see here, all kinds of programmatic information are combined in a single totality of continuous spatial landscapes. The landscape and its manipulation, for instance, by suddenly interrupting the currents to make way for an activity that requires another tempo, seem to be extremely effective. The world of objects becomes interconnected. It is an integration of many things in a huge totality with a multiplicity of voices. The idea of living in an enclosed space no longer makes sense, but has become a fiction. Walls become floors. Architecture becomes infrastructure. All that counts is a dynamic surface. Negotiation with everything in the field of activities is a key to design. Borders are there for crossing. This horizontality is a coherent way of making room for the perpetual contradictions of global processes and local singularities. This is the landscape of the faceless capitalism of transnational entrepreneurs. In this world, landscapes replace old city centers. The city center is no longer a unifying element. Instead, it's the landscape that fulfills this function. Arjan Geuze, his Biennale booklet, and you see also himself, and it's not upside down, but this is the way he likes to show his datascapes of the periphery. Fresh conservatism overlooks the fact that there is such a thing as a political dimension to everyday life. It forgets that the landscape also has its vertical moments. Fresh conservatism changes the everyday world into an attractive carpet metropolis, glossing over the consequences of reality. That there is more to reality than a splendid visual surface seems not to concern these architects. The subsoil becomes polluted and eroded. Reality is transformed into a wonderful, beautiful panorama. The true nature of the artificial landscape is much more complex, more confrontational, and far more exciting than fresh conservative panoramas would lead us to believe. This means that we come up against a trend that many architects want to include as many differences and consequences in the landscape as possible, including forms of conflicts and risky spaces, without bothering to categorize them. Whatever the moral issues, and no matter who are the concerned parties, they are all giving all the space they need on, between, in, or under all the layers of interpretation and multiformity. And it's exactly here that the potential and danger of the landscape lies. Koolhaas rightly pointed out that the landscape effortlessly unites the non-unifiable, covering the unpalatable, converting vulgar consumption into an oasis. Landscape is fast, simple, cheap, and efficient. It is flexible and free of controversy. It can be either decorative or programmatic. Landscape covers the cool, the sterile, and the chaotic, the natural, and the artificial. Landscape can be either left or right, critical or uncritical, frivolous or serious, Disneyland or cemetery. This new generation of designers has driven the familiar landscape of normality to a fewer pitch of alienating ecstasy. The danger exists that this dynamic and shift of position will give rise to a friction that either does not know where it is going or else refuses to say. Unfortunately, the everyday world as displayed in its fresh radical guise is not sufficient. Conservative voices remain untouched and even reinvent themselves into new dynamic open systems, as there are the global invisible powers within the abstract space of flows. They have simply put on different, fresher garb, the emperor's new clothes. In these landscapes, the recipropresent is unveiled in state of ecstasy. We are faced with a form of criticism as aesthetic transgression. What we need, however, is an architecture of the everyday that would avoid any aestheticization of concept and form by taking a political stance in its aesthetics, so not what we see here. This means that program, concept and form combine to form a cultural perspective. The design will express certain social expectations and consequences, contradictions and requirements, and these aspirations have to be openly stated. And then I think we can also go beyond the banality of the everyday. So fresh conservatism is in the end musifying in a fresh way the new conservative tendencies containing in the landscape. This horizontality points to an art and architecture which is like liquid. It links a whole range of statements that are in a sense parallel to those of the new languages of science, electronics, DNA, biology, chaos, disasters, infrastructures, etc. It is this wave-like process which allows for a whole variety of formations that connect up in many directions. This way of working resembles that of video jockeys, the culture of zapping, sampling, shopping, remote control, and even genetic manipulation. Michael Hayes rightly remarked that a certain ideological smoothness makes its appearance. By rejecting the theory of the difference and replacing it with a network of relations with different sections, you are on very thin ice ideologically, he says. The effect is to obscure the reality on which the ideology was originally based. Las Vegas. What is lacking here is the idea that a social structure is composed of various fields or levels, some of which are more influential than others. Ideological smoothness would seem to be the typical mode of expression of Michael Hayes, as he says, generation of baby boomers and their younger brothers and sisters. Through historical circumstances and class affinity, they have developed a particular pattern of cultural production and consumption. In this pattern, different forms of cultural expression are disrupted, as though all distinctions between high and low, hip and passé, left and right have virtually been abolished. It all comes down to the well-known adults' lullaby, don't worry, be happy. And now we come to the last part, and that is, I want to indicate how to overcome this problem of fresh conservatism. When we understand that we need to operate within our second modernity, so not going outside this modernity, it's unavoidable that we have to operate in our society of the end, then it's also, of course, we also have to think how we could overcome the don't worry, be happy attitude, which was, or just the diversity and anything goes is possible, because then I think we fall in the trap of fresh conservatism. For the moment, the approach I'm now trying to develop is, I also call and concepts. So there are also a kind of open systems we also find in our society as a whole, and I think also the alternative must be a kind of open dynamic systems as well. So that's why I think also the concepts we should develop should not be of an either-or construction, as also society is not developing anymore in either-or logics. The idea of an and concept has to do with a kind of open system which is full of antagonism and paradoxes and ambiguities. And it's not so much fixed and linear, it's more dialogical. And concepts are the motor for new possibilities based on a certain doses of violence or subversion of what already exists. which stimulates and enforces a dialogue, and that involves a new radical idea of democracy, which is based on differences and a certain doses of alienation, subversion through violence, which stimulates exchange and openness. Here, in fact, we come closer to the acceptance of differences between values. And I believe that liberation cannot be in any condition without the inclusion of an element of force or violence. And that's why we have to ask ourselves the question in which way force is organized in society and what kind of types of forces are acceptable in a democratic society. And here, as I said, here's the project where you could also read it in a different way, that in fact this museum was implemented in a quite poor area in Barcelona, and it's actually a quite elite kind of museum, and also I think the way the architecture, the way the museum is built, a kind of white concept museum, where the world of the curator is more or less enlarged and not questioned or opened up, etc. That the intervention by 3 architects, but also MVRDV, is that they provide for the local people in this area sporting facilities. Is a kind of confrontation or questioning the institution of the museum, but also bringing in other qualities in that area which travel beyond the wide concept of this museum. So let us look to a short moment to the Netherlands. And I also will have a short look to Singapore, because I think in these kind of modest paradises of total comfort, there is no kind of violence of any kind. And the question is if we do like to live in this kind of consensus terrorism, because it looks like a perfect world, and who would be against it? So here we see, for instance, a frog tunnel, because the frogs have to go to the other ponds when they want to make children. So we built a very nice tunnel to the other side. And so in the Netherlands, each square meter has a destination. For everything exists a law, an institution, support club, or commission. And also here, this is Singapore. The Singapore government guarantees everything you need. It knows what you need before you know it yourself. Everything is accord with comfort and voluntarily social engineered correct middle class behavior. So there was, for instance, in Singapore, you probably know that both women and men work very hard, have a very good career. So the problem is that they don't meet anymore. So the government is sponsoring cruise boat travel holidays in order to meet your future partner. In the Netherlands, we even installed, this is another picture of Singapore, where the cab company is entitled Comfort, and as you can read, all those letters stand, of course, for the appropriate way you should operate: caring, observant, mindful, friendly, etc., etc. So, who would be against this kind of qualities? In the Netherlands, we even installed legal finish off places for hookers who are addicted to drugs. So that's in a kind of non-place, in a kind of periphery, where the police is at the gate and they are cleaning people, and then the cars drive in with a hooker, they have a fuck, and then they can leave again, and the government is keeping it clean and in good order. And in our free time, we enjoy, preferably in groups, the many party center, tropical swim paradises, and theme parks. And what we also, for instance, have is that each year there is an international championship of mowing machine races. And in the time which is then left, we found clubs, and we do not rest until our whole country is covered and tiled. In fact, in such a world in which reform takes place, as in the Netherlands, where almost all of the time any violence is avoided, it's not a world in which I like to live. It could be either an absolute undimensional society in which 100% of the population would agree with any single reform, or in one in which the decisions would be made by an army of social engineers with the backing of the rest of the population, as in the Netherlands. Any reform involves changing the status quo, and in most cases this will hurt existing interests. The process of reform is a process of struggles, not a process of quiet piecemeal engineering, as we quite a lot do in the Netherlands and in Singapore. And there is nothing to regret. It is in this active process of struggle that human abilities, new language games could be created. So I believe that the inclusion of violence can be appropriated in so-called the and concepts within our society of the and. And of course we have to be very exact what we define as violence. In fact, I want to make clear that there can only be freedom when a certain dose of violence is part of our experience. And a middle-class paradise like Singapore and the Netherlands is in fact trying to duck any kind of violence as motor for more freedom. And that's in fact what I want to warn for, and it's probably not a coincidence that many fresh conservative works are being created in the Netherlands. They have a kind of fake choice, but in fact they don't introduce a certain subversion in order really to open up other and better possibilities. And now I come to a kind of summary of what I think an and concept is about, and it's not everything, but it's a kind of start. So I will do a kind of sum up. And concepts operate within our society of the and. We should and cannot deny the existing condition of megacity globalization development. We have to relate to the acted out lived and experienced everyday life. No negative denial into worlds of without anymore. We have to accept that all concepts are incomplete. And utopia outside the existing condition is no option, and above all, an illusion. We have to see the paradoxes of our life as the motor for our existence and innovation. Commodification and liberation go together, as we saw in this Dancing the Samba in Marseille. It is not an either-or dialectics. Striving for harmony and the whole, and locating the truth there is no way to walk. As soon as we found a truth, we should discover a new one. We have to move and should not make dead objects. Perhaps we are in for some genetic codes instead. We look for projects that move us, who are ambiguous and raise more questions than answers. We have to locate the traces of the future in the now. With the notion of within, we also address the dimension of usefulness. With usefulness, we address the idea of the plurality of the actual and the possible, of a becoming, of also satisfying human possibilities. Differences are the motor for dialogue spaces. And above all, we slowly have to develop a moment of praxis again in our society. When we work within, we address the large audience, and do we avoid a kind of island architecture? Concepts of without or negativity do on the contrary not activate us, but freeze us in space. More than ever in the age of the great biography, we have to operate within. And this notion of operating within defines the void as a moment of incompleteness, risk, struggle, dialogue, and paradox. Secondly, besides the notion of within, we have to radicalize our everyday condition through a certain doses of violence or alienation, while maintaining and not denying the banal, the normal of the everyday. We cannot just wanting to be blinded by the everyday, as so many designers and architects want to do, as in, for instance, the Netherlands, and I think also Wouter van Stiphout with Crimson, who will lecture here later in the coming months, is doing. We should always be bringing forth new things. Otherwise, what are we here for? And these new things are to be found in reality. We must grasp reality, but not without radicalizing it. And this idea relates back to the need to include differences within the project in order to install a democratic, civil space. No consensus culture without contradictions, please. We should read alienating as something positive, as a force, even as a void full of potential. We can no longer do without the dialectical contradiction between being at home and now being homeless, for instance. Being homeless is already an alienating effect which makes us feel at home more than ever. The negative observation of a loss will no longer do in our virtual reality. Non-places are places too. An end concept should be understood also as a kind of open dynamic system, as for instance the VPRO, where there is a constant positioning or interpretation. It should be a kind of situated knowledge. It should be a multiplicity of genres and voices, where differences in value are forced into a dialogue and institutional differences are not denied but exposed in their paradoxical existence. And finally, an end concept is of a social democratic dimension. Although it should be constantly dynamic and never finished, always to be negotiated, it should stress the need for the these days outstripped idea of any place for human agency. We have to satisfy human possibilities more than ever. But this human agency is not striving for some model of harmony. It should offer to reconstruct, if not to recreate, the construction of socialism. And that's not what we see here. An idea of sociality which creates spaces for different differences, a multiculturalism without political discrimination, the research or the richness of different cuisines and voices. Perhaps we have, as Deleuze said, following Eisenstein, to develop a new level of being, that which Eisenstein calls the dividual, in which the individuality is not effaced but completed by a collectivity of multiculturalism. This individual is not a subject striving for finding its inner self as subject, but is constantly through movement subjectifying her and himself, always anew in dialogical spaces full of individual and collective reflexivity. And I think this is all very abstract, so I thought I bring in a very simple example, and I thought we go to the detail level. And so, for instance, the notion of within, operating within our society, is that this is the exhibition space of the Kunsthal by Rem Koolhaas in Rotterdam, we're probably all familiar with. And I think that Koolhaas is not denying the role of the museum, but so he operates within, he operates within even to a certain extent a kind of wide concept of the museum, a kind of loft space. But at the same time, while he operates within and is not justifying in good or bad, he brings in a rather weird element on the level, for instance, of the column. Of course, there are other things in this museum, the way it cuts through and relates to the city and to the park, etc., but we leave that out, and colors, etc. There's a kind of subversive element, and that's the tree. And this tree is a kind of violence or alienating effect in order to provoke the people who use the space, the curators, but also the people who go into the space to see an exhibition. In some sense, the curator has to think, which are mostly trained in a kind of wide concept, a kind of so-called fake idea of a neutral space. They have to do something with this column. They have to relate to this detail, and it will be, for most of them, a kind of painful experience. And if they do it well, they somehow interact with this column and are by that also re-questioning or rearranging the role of the museum in an exhibition. And I think also that in this example, through this column, Koolhaas is not only just doing a subversive act, but I think is also thinking what the role of the museum should be in today's society. There is a kind of political social agenda of at least what the museum should not be. It should not be a kind of traditional classical building Aldo Rossi did build, for instance, in Maastricht, where everything is monumentalized and really disconnected somehow from the real. Also, it's not a kind of commercial theme park museum as we can see in Mendini in Groningen. Even you could say it's a certain relation to modern traditions of space and the role of the museum. So I think there is definitely also a social agenda, while you cannot say it's either this or that. There's always an overlapping of different values, a certain open system. some examples. It's even so that through this column you can also call it that there's a kind of stammering in the system. The system is not totally finished. It's not a real design for design's sake. But it's a kind of dirty details perhaps which provoke a certain activity, a certain relation to how, when you make an exhibition there, how to do that. And to think about the whole concept of what an exhibition is. And it's in fact not only me who is explaining works through the lens of and concepts. Also Deleuze explains, for instance, Godard's work with the idea of the end in mind. And I quote, "What counts isn't 2 or 3 or however many, it's and, the conjunction and. And isn't even a specific conjunction or relation. It brings in all relations. There are as many relations as ands. And doesn't just upset all relations. It upsets being, the verb, and so on. And is precisely a creative stammering, a foreign use of language, as opposed to a conformist and dominant use based on the verb to be. In this kind of and concept, the antagonism, though socially regulated, will subsist under the form of what could be called a war of position. Each pole of the conflict will have a certain power and will exercise a certain violence over the other pole. The paradoxical corollary of this conclusion is that the existence of violence and antagonism is the very condition of a free society. The reason for this is that antagonism results from the fact that the social is not a plurality of effects radiating from a pre-given center, but is pragmatically constructed from many starting points. And I'd like to end with the last slide, which is a kind of simple conclusion that we should never make final points, but while we make the point, while the point of the position is being made, there is always a comma to be negotiated. So you position yourself and at the same time you pose a question. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? Do you want to take any questions?
Yeah, no problem. I have many questions, but...
Could you suggest how to design products?
No, that is one simple example. That's why I ended with the example on the detail level of Koolhaas, of the Kunsthal, for instance, where there is a kind of paradoxical situation there. And I think there are many examples to deal with contradictions. Especially for me, it's simpler even in film and theater, like Brecht and other people.
Well, the question is, one man can design products.
One man can
design a paradox.
One man can design a paradox. Now, I think you cannot just make a paradox itself, but you can create conditions where a paradox is being acted out. So for another example, that's not a paradox. I think the thing of the Kunsthal is that there is a kind of contradictional situation there, and it's not just a paradox for the sake of having a paradox, but somehow through its position taken about what an exhibition should be, it through the paradox or certain contradictions, it acts out in relation to the others, a kind of contradiction situation. And of course, I remember that when the Kunsthal was opened, that Rem Koolhaas didn't want to be at the opening because the people who made the exhibition built an exhibition in not painting the columns, but totally wrapping them in. So there is always the thing that in the end, if people are not sensitive to a space, don't have tradition, they can always overrule what a building does. But still, the way you cross through the building, the way the building relates to the park, the people outside, inside, going through the building, the movements, etc., and also a kind of detailing which is not installing the building on its own, is of course a kind of acceptance of schizophrenic conditions or contradictions. But this is just on the design level, and I think you can make a cross section through the history of architecture and urbanism, tracing all the people what they try to do, and it's much more object-based, and in the biography sometimes it happens by accident even. And actually, that's what I want to do, to come up with many examples which do that. And I see also that quite many architects and urban planners, as you also do with Cora, are trying to work on that, on those kind of notions. But there is also, I think, if the awareness is not there for a certain kind of critical and social positioning or ideological position, the risk is that there comes out a kind of new nostalgia or a new belief in the new modernism, which is not. I think we still have social responsibilities and a kind of democratic responsibilities also to be against certain things, but not in a kind of linear way. It has to be like this and that, but we have to bring them both in to make. Anyway.
Do you think there's a sort of irony in the sense that many of the work that you're sort of criticizing, calling fresh conservatism, is actually produced by people who are in Corliss's office?
Yeah, I think that there's a problem that I know that in the office of Koolhaas there are not really, as far as I know, really debates about the attitude or the real essence of what I think Koolhaas is still somehow concerned with, although he doesn't speak so much about it. So I think many people who come out of the office don't get the real attitude, which is maybe where Koolhaas is working on. It's not being educated, I think. I think not that it's his mistake, but at least it's not understood. I think you can also see it if you compare the Farmark's book with the book of Oma, of what Rem Koolhaas did. I think you immediately see there is no understanding of what a kind of reflexive culture or a progressive culture could be when you operate with the forces within. I think it's often much too naive, unfortunately.
I mean, in a way, it's sort of reiterating what happened to sort of lots of times in this century, like with modernism, the way that the social program modernism dropped at a certain period and became aestheticized.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So there's coming really a kind of nostalgia of the second modernity. I think also governments like Tony Blair or Clinton or Wim Kok in the Netherlands, the Polder model, is also a kind of fresh conservatism. Benetton, or many art who wants to interact with the everyday, etc. I think, unfortunately, I think it's a huge problem we have to overcome.
According to your theory, I think those problems has to be incorporated within the system rather than enforced.
Yes, oh yes, yeah. So that's why I say that the many aspects of the strategy, which also fresh conservatives are applying, you have to be aware of the problem, and sometimes it won't work, and then you can also surpass it. So it's not say. So there are many aspects of the strategy which are very important, and you can also see it that some, even if they don't understand it, that still they can make a good work because the way they operate. I think the VPRO building is, for instance, quite good work. Although some other buildings it goes totally wrong, turns into a spectacle. But what I experience now through writing the text, that more and more slowly, if the people are open-minded, and that's also why I try to write a text, to make clear how difficult it is to operate differently. It's not to pin them down, but to say, be careful, because you have to travel further. And some young architecture offices more or less start to understand that. At least the one I speak with. Not all of them, of course. They even invited me to do an exhibition because Adrian Geuze, for instance, liked the title Fresh Conservatism very much because he thought it was a very positive term.
I mean, I find your arguments interesting, and I do think it is helpful to actually understand the work which is made in common. I do have a problem with one of your assumptions, which I think is actually a large, big assumption in your arguments, and which is to do with the fact that there is less and less difference. Yeah. So if you look at it from the social point of view. And I wonder whether it is not, at least to some extent, a cultural conceit, invention by people. I do find actually as an invention that is very interesting, but then
Mhm.
like Blair government in this country. And I guess another point, the question of difference is I do not actually feel that one can compare comfortably or credibly the politics of Southeast Asia, which is something of course all has like to do and a number of other people, with the way we think of difference in the West. It seems
Oh, I agree.
to be something which is quite different, and within
That's true.
social expectations which are very different. So I guess my question is, is difference really so much less today than it was, say, 20 years ago?
Yeah, that's of course a $5 million question. But now I think there's on huge levels, I think there's much more, in my opinion, much more sameness. But I think also if you look very well, I still believe that in the way that people act out the everyday life, there is a tremendous amount of differences indeed. So what the sociologists call reflexive modernization, that there are two aspects that about the notion of reflexive. There, on the one hand, if we are rich, let's say, or well educated, we can reflect a lot about our condition. We can really act out our own life. We can have many different choices, etc. In that sense, for us, I would say there is, of course, maybe for a larger extent, much more choice involved. Also, there are in those choices we make, or we think the freedom of choices, there are many risks involved, and also many risks which makes us somehow more same, but not so much different. But we experience it as different. So that's not really an answer to your question, I think. But what's for me important is that is to create different differences. That means that when we are maybe the same or not totally the same, is to act out those differences between people or different organizations and to start to have a dialogue about it. And I think, first of all, there's much more individualization. There is less and less dialogue through the lack of concentration, individualization, career, organizing your own life, etc., etc. So there is less dialogue, so there's a less, you could call intersubjectivity, where you can negotiate or act out your own subject. You're more and more turned inward to yourself. There's less exchange. So for me, the question is not so much are there less differences or more differences. It's more important, can there be different differences based on what we have now? And I think it's very much possible in this more kind of open dynamic society. There is a lot of opportunity because we have knowledge and can act out our own life. There are opportunities to do so. I think only it's not happening so much. Only on the level of acting out our real life still we overcome sometimes sameness. And about your question about not that it's impossible to compare Asia, for instance, with the conditions here, I agree. But what you could see if you look to the network society and you see in Asia what's happening with the mega city, you see many parallel developments, partly to westernization and Americanization, and that globalization is in fact a very global effect, but it's totally controlled by a very small amount of people and a small amount of industries. And you can see what kind of effect it has in Asia and also has here in London and in other mega cities development throughout the world to become a kind of same sort of cities. But of course in Asia somehow they sometimes skip industrialization. They are immediately in second modernity, so you get totally other conditions than here, as you can saw in hopefully in the Hanoi picture. I hope this is some kind of answer to your question.
There's one example that may be relevant for you. The World Cup recently created, of course, an incredible globalizing force. And then France won. There's a lot of national pride for that, a lot of criticism about that too. But then some of the stars that won in the World Cup were, one of them, for example, I forgot his name, was from one of the banlieues of Marseille, of Algerian origin. On the one hand, this is your second modernity, I think. On the other hand, after the criticism about nationalism died down, certainly there was a lot of observation of an incredible increase in pride and identification in these populations, for example, the outskirts of Marseille. Little boys of 9 suddenly felt, wow, it is actually
Of course.
something. That was really an incredible phenomenon suddenly that happened after that.
But still, they are in the outskirts, although they have a new belief in a kind of maybe not the American dream, but the football dream, that they can plan their own career and become also that person. But if you look in the peripheries of Paris on a large scale, and you see the studies of Pierre Bourdieu, La Misère du Monde, unfortunately there are many differences, but there are very problematic differences. But it's true that certain global conditions, you can also be very positive about certain aspects, and which can be used indeed, like like we saw on Dancing the Samba, for instance, that at the same time they dress up totally conventional in the sense that I think also to dress up as travestites or accepted, etc. But the way those people come together, even in those transformations, there is something happening based on those strange conventions, which is also liberating. It's possible. That maybe we didn't have before. So we have to be very careful to look at it.
If you impose sinister on it, but if the government actually engineered that kind of range of the nationality in the national football team, I mean that is quite actually dangerous situation actually.
Mm-hmm.
And the question, but I think the question should be still asked to actually who does design this paradoxical situation and how, and it has to be in a way very transparent and has to be accountable. Yeah. Otherwise, it becomes very dangerous political.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, right. Yeah. And then you get fresh conservatism, in my opinion. Yeah. Because it has precisely the idea that it is really changing and opening up different value systems against each other, but it's not. Like Benetton. It's a very flat example, but.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you.